The early morning air was heavy with silence, broken only by the sharp click of the widow's boots on the pavement as she stepped outside. Cradling a neatly folded American flag in her arms, her face was pale, her eyes red from sleeplessness, and crying, yet she held herself with quiet dignity, the same kind of dignity her husband, a fallen Marine, had taught her to carry. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint golden hue across the modest apartment complex she had once called home. Today it no longer was. Cardboard boxes sat by the curb, stuffed with the contents of a life built in love and loyalty. Her wedding photo in a cracked frame peeked out from one of them, while her husband's uniform hung folded inside a clear garment bag, untouched since his funeral. The landlord, a tall man in a suit far too clean for the hour, stood on the steps with a clipboard, completely indifferent to the weight of what he was doing. "You had the notice. I'm just enforcing the policy," he said flatly, barely making eye contact. His tone was cold, dismissive, as if she were just another overdue tenant, not the widow of a hero who had given his life for the country. She didn't respond. There was nothing to say that would change his mind, and she refused to let him see her break. Instead, she bent down to lift a small suitcase, her fingers trembling slightly. Every item she picked up wasn't just furniture or clothing, it was a memory, a piece of a shared life that had already been shattered by loss. And now, by heartless bureaucracy. Neighbors peeked through curtains, whispering but not stepping out. A child on a bike stopped across the street, watching quietly as the woman stood beside her belongings. Alone, abandoned by the very system her husband died protecting. Her chest rose and fell slowly, trying to keep steady, though her world was falling apart all over again. This wasn't just eviction, it felt like erasure. And still, she stood tall, holding the flag to her chest like a shield, her eyes locked on the front door that had just been closed to her. What the landlord didn't know, what no one yet knew, was that within minutes, justice was already on its way, wearing dress blues and riding steel. She sat on the cold concrete curb, just outside the apartment gate, her knees pulled close to her chest, the folded flag resting in her lap like a silent witness to everything she had lost. Her hands trembled as she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. The screen cracked, just like everything else in her life. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. There weren't many people left to call. Family was gone. Friends had drifted away after the funeral, unsure of what to say, uncomfortable around the kind of grief that didn't fade with time. Then she remembered a number. It had been saved in her phone for months. The number of her husband's closest comrade from the unit, someone he had called brother more often than his own blood. She tapped the contact, unsure of what she was going to say, unsure if she could even get the words out. The phone rang once, twice, and then a deep voice answered. "This is Staff Sergeant Torres." For a moment, she couldn't speak. Her throat tightened as her eyes welled up again. But then, as if something broke inside her, the words came out in a trembling whisper. "They kicked me out, the landlord. He just said I had to leave." There was a pause. Not long, just enough for the weight of her words to hit. Then the voice on the other end turned sharp, focused. "Word, are you? Don't move. I'm coming. We're all coming." She didn't know what we meant, but she felt something shift. For the first time that day, she didn't feel alone. The call ended, and she sat there, the phone resting on her knee, her arms wrapped around the flag. Behind her, the apartment building stood silent, but ahead somewhere down the road, boots were already hitting the ground. A low rumble began to build in the distance. Faint at first, so soft it could have been mistaken for distant thunder, but as the seconds passed, it grew louder, heavier, more deliberate. The widow looked up from her place on the curb, her tear-streaked face catching the early morning light. Then she saw them. One by one, dark green trucks rounded the corner, their engines growling with purpose. Behind them came motorcycles, polished and gleaming, driven by men in full uniform. Their faces were solemn, eyes locked forward, as if on a mission. These weren't just friends or old comrades. These were brothers, bonded by blood, loss, and loyalty, and they had come. The neighbors who had only watched silently before now emerged from their homes. Drawn by the sound, curtains fluttered, doors creaked open. Children were lifted into arms to get a better view. The sight unfolding on that quiet suburban street was unlike anything they had ever seen. As the convoy slowed to a stop, 50 Marines stepped out in unison. Boots hit pavement with thunderous precision. Uniforms crisp, postures straight. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Their presence alone said everything. She would not be left behind. Not on their watch. The widow stood slowly, eyes wide, heart pounding. Staff Sergeant Torres, tall and commanding, walked straight up to her. No words were exchanged. He simply placed a hand gently on her shoulder and gave a small, respectful nod. Around them, the others formed a tight line, not a wall of defense, but a statement. She belongs here, and in that moment, everything changed. The Marines didn't wait for orders, they moved like a unit, disciplined and precise, as if this was just another mission. But this one was personal. Without hesitation, they approached the scattered boxes and furniture by the curb. Some lifted heavy dressers, others carefully carried framed photos, lamps, and worn-out cushions that had once made the widow's apartment a home. Each item was treated with the utmost care, as though it carried the memory of the fallen Marine himself. Neighbors looked on in stunned silence, many with hands over their mouths, others filming in disbelief. A few even stepped forward to help, moved by the sheer force of solidarity and respect that had descended upon their quiet street. The landlord watched from his office window, jaw clenched, but he didn't dare come outside, not with 50 Marines standing tall on his property. Inside the apartment, the once empty living room slowly transformed. Furniture was placed, exactly as it had been. The worn couch, the bookshelf, the small dining table where the couple had shared meals and laughter. A Marine unfolded a framed photo of the widow and her husband in uniform, placing it gently on the mantel. Another Marine laid out a rug, smoothing it down with the kind of care usually reserved for a fallen comrade's flag. Then, almost ceremoniously, Staff Sergeant Torres walked in carrying the folded American flag the widow had clutched all morning. Without a word, he placed it on the highest shelf in the room, centered perfectly. Around him, every Marine stood still, hats removed, backs straight. The home wasn't just restored, it was reclaimed with honor. As the last piece of furniture was set down and the room began to look like home again, the widow stood in the center, overwhelmed, her hands covering her mouth, eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She turned slowly, taking it all in. The couch placed exactly where it used to be, the bookshelf standing firm once more, the flag proudly displayed like a sacred relic of love and sacrifice. The silence inside was thick with reverence, the kind only shared by those who had seen war, grief, and brotherhood. Then came the sound of a door creaking open. Sharp, nervous, the landlord stepped out from his office at the edge of the building, adjusting his tie with uneasy hands. He had seen the entire event unfold from behind his blinds, watched as 50 Marines arrived with the force of a battalion and the tenderness of a family. Now he stood on the sidewalk, hesitant, as if unsure whether to speak or slink away. But the Marines didn't move. They stood like statues outside the widow's apartment, a human wall of honor, watching, waiting. As the landlord took a few slow steps forward, Staff Sergeant Torres broke formation and walked toward him, his eyes locked in a hard, unwavering stare. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The two men stood face to face, the landlord trying to muster some kind of authority, but it melted under the weight of Torres' silent strength. For a moment, the world held still. The widow watched from the doorway, not with hatred, but with quiet certainty that justice had arrived, not from the courts, not from the system, but from the very people her husband once bled beside. Torres finally spoke, low and firm. "You may own this building, but she owns our respect. You should have thought about that before you turned your back on a Marine's family." The landlord blinked, trying to speak, but no words came. He looked around at the rows of uniforms, the eyes that held no fear, and realized this was a battle he had already lost. Then, in perfect unison, the Marines turned back toward the apartment, saluting the widow one by one as they passed. Not a word was said, but their message thundered louder than any eviction notice ever could. She will never be alone, not as long as the Corps remembers, not as long as they breathe. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting light over the scene, the landlord turned and walked away smaller than before, silenced by something far greater than rules and rent, loyalty, honor, and the unbreakable promise made between warriors.